Let's dive into the graph editor and some basic navigation. I'm going to use the sphere, and you can see that I have a couple of keys in my timeline on frame 1, 12, and 24. Now you can open up the graph editor using either that meld button you created in setup, or you can go to the menu Windows, Animation Editor, and then select the graph editor. Now I'm using the classic UI. Modern looks like this, but to be honest, classic is a little cleaner, but you can choose between them. If you go to preferences and then go to settings, animation, and scroll down to graph editor, you can pick between classic or modern. Now, before we start, I want you guys to make sure that you have the time snap in the graph editor selected. And close up on that looks like this. You want to make sure that it's selected and glows blue. And that way you know that if your move keys in the graph editor, that they will actually snap to the next nearest time frame instead of having a decimal representation. We want to make sure that we're on whole numbers and not decimal numbers. Now, with the rig selected, you can see that there's a bunch of lines in that graph editor. Now, these lines are called animation curves, and they represent your animation, the translation, rotation, anything you might have done to that control curve in animation. You can see that represented in the graph editor by these animation curves. Now, some of these curves might be flat, and that means there's no particular, no movement on that particular curve. So the ball, it moves from left to right. There is no up and down movement. So if we take a look at translate Y, which is up and down, we can see that that particular curve is completely flat. There's no movement. It's dead, right? So it's flatlined. But the ball does move from left to right, and that would be translate X. So if we see the ball is moving from left to right, we take a look at that translate X, and we can see that curve. It actually has a curved line. It is not flat, and that is representing movement. Now, in the graph editor, value is up and down, and time is left to right. So if you look in the classic graph editor, you can see your numbers starting at 0, going out to, well, in this case, we have 24 frames. So time is represented down to bottom, and it is left to right. If you are using modern, that those time numbers will be at the top, starting at 0, and then going to the extent of what your timeline is. Value is up and down. So when you see an animation curve that is flat, right, that means there is no value change, right? So example, that translate Y, you see no value change in that number. Now on the value side, you'll see that the numbers go from negative lower to a positive higher. And so we can see if I select translate X and go to frame 1, we can see that frame 1, that key at frame 1 in the graph editor is much lower. You can see that right now it's at a negative 8 or 9. And as the ball moves across the screen, that value changes. If I select the key at frame 12, you can see it's around 0 in value. And if I go to where the ball stops on the other side of the screen, you can see that value is much higher than it was at frame 1. Now, you can actually change these values, and we can change them in the graph editor, but we can also manipulate things in our viewport. So let's say if we moved frame 12 a little bit further to the right, and then I keyed it, you can see that actually change in the graph editor. You can see that that value at frame 12 moved up. I'll see that back and undo that. And so frame 12 actually changed we keyed its position and it changed value in that graph editor. What I'm going to do is show you guys how to manipulate that controller by moving a key. And so I'm going to select the key itself. And to move it in the graph editor, you hold down Shift and then middle mouse, you're going to get a question mark. Now, it's basically saying, which way do you want to move this key? And if you move it up and down, it's going to give you an up and down arrow. And that's basically, it's locked in place. So at this point, I cannot move that key left or right, which would be time in the graph editor. Now the ball physically, you can see down below, is actually moving left and right, but that's because I'm moving it in value up or down, right? So if I do this again and I don't hold that Shift down and I try to move it, you can see I get this kind of a cross. And now you can see I'm actually moving this ball, I'm moving the key in time. I moved it all the way to frame 23. And I don't want to do that. So when I'm moving things in the graph editor, I want to make sure that I'm moving it in value, not in time. If we're doing a lot of adjustment in time, you want to do that in your timeline. And we'll play with value in the graph editor. So let's try that again. I'm going to select the key that I want to adjust, and I'm going to hold down Shift, middle mouse, get that question mark, and I want to move my mouse up and down until I see the up and down arrow. Now, if I move my mouse and I get a left and right, I know that means I'm moving this key in time, and I don't want to do that. So I'm gonna deselect everything, then reselect it again, then hold Shift, middle mouse, get that question mark, and then I can move that key in value up and down. Now, if you're trying this and it's not working, and let's say you're getting a dot, okay, if that's happening, that means you have the selection tool on, and you want to make sure you either have translate or rotate as the tool. So that's either W or E as a hotkey. And once you've done that, you can actually move those keys. Now, another thing we can do is actually manipulate the in-betweens. So I'm going to turn on that ghosting, and so we can see these in-betweens. And I'm going to select the translate Y, which is my left and right movement. And I'm going to select that key again in the middle. Now, when you select those keys, you're going to see that there are some handles on either side of that key. And if you select one side and then left click, and you'll get that 4 arrows, and just manipulate your mouse so that you're rotating those handles up or down. Now, there's 2 handles, but they are locked together. And you can see what's happening with the in-betweens. It's actually, if I go one direction, it's pushing these in-betweens further towards the outside keys. And if I rotate it the other direction, it's pulling these in-betweens a little bit closer. So these handles allow us to manipulate the in-between spacing to varying degrees. And sometimes you can do it in a way that causes problems with your animation. So you got to be very careful with how you use these handles. So practice makes perfect. Now you can break these handles to use them individually. And you do that by selecting this little V up here, and that breaks those handles. And then you select one handle individually, one or the other. I'll select this one down here. You marquee select it, and then left click to hold that handle. And you can adjust the spacing of those in-betweens. Now, if you can't rotate those handles, right, either way, you might have the selection tool on. So that's another thing that could be happening if you're trying to select the handles, and it's like, well, I have the handle selected, and I'm using my left mouse. You can even use your middle mouse for this as well. If you use your middle mouse, you'll see that dot again, and that tells you, hey, whoa, I need to have my translation tool selected. And when I do that, I hit W, and now I can actually manipulate that handle once again. So that is some of the basics of navigating the graph editor. We're going to be using the graph editor mostly in the first week. And in the demos for the ball assignments, we're going to further explore its use in animation.